there is a story that almost all of us learn without ever realizing it. The story that consciousness is born inside the brain, that thoughts, feelings, and even the simple sensation of existing are nothing more than electrical activity. But there is a huge problem with this explanation. The brain can generate signals, it can generate behaviors, it can generate reactions. But to this day, no one has been able to explain something very simple: how matter turns into conscious experience. And maybe that happens because there is a hidden lie at the center of this story. And in the next few minutes, we are going to explore a possibility that could profoundly change the way you understand who you are. Maybe consciousness was never produced by the brain. Maybe the brain is only an instrument through which something much deeper experiences the world. And when that idea truly begins to make sense, something shifts quietly inside you. The feeling of being nothing more than matter begins to fade. From a very early age, almost without noticing, we learn what seems to be a simple explanation about who we are. We are told that everything we feel, think, and experience happens inside the brain. Consciousness would simply be the result of billions of neurons exchanging electrical signals with each other. This idea appears in books, in science classes, and even in the way we talk in everyday life. Little by little, it settles silently into our worldview. We begin to believe that thoughts are just chemical reactions, and that emotions are simply neural circuits in motion. In this model, the brain becomes the great generator of the mind, an extraordinarily complex organ that produces everything we call experience. The story sounds elegant, logical, and complete. And perhaps that is exactly why almost no one stops to question it. When science began to investigate the brain more deeply, it seemed as though this explanation was getting closer and closer to being confirmed. Today, we can observe the brain in action with astonishing precision. We can see which regions activate when someone makes a decision, recalls a memory, or recognizes a familiar face. We can map patterns of neural activity, record electrical impulses, and track communication between different parts of the nervous system. All of this reveals an extraordinary level of biological organization. The more we learn about the brain, the more impressive it appears. It is therefore natural that many scientists concluded that consciousness simply emerges from this process, as if thoughts and sensations were inevitable side effects of neural circuits in operation. But when we look at this picture more carefully, something deeply strange begins to appear. We can measure brain activity with incredible precision, yet we still cannot explain why that activity is accompanied by conscious experience. We can observe neurons firing and electrical signals moving through the brain, but none of these measurements explain why there is something that perceives all of this happening, why there is sensation, why there is perception, why there is presence. Science can describe the physical mechanisms of the mind in great detail, but there is an enormous gap between describing processes and explaining the experience of being alive. It is as if we could perfectly observe the workings of a complex machine, yet still not understand why there is someone inside it witnessing everything. And it is precisely at this point that the mystery of consciousness begins to reveal itself. Because the deeper we investigate the brain, the more we realize that it does not fully answer the central question. It explains how information is processed, how decisions are made, and how memories are stored. But it does not explain why experience exists at all. It does not explain why there is a point of view from which the world is perceived. This boundary is so profound that many philosophers began to call it the hard problem of consciousness. Not because it is merely a technical problem, but because perhaps we have been looking at consciousness in the wrong way from the very beginning. If questions like this awaken something in you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we explore the deepest mysteries of consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence. Not to offer quick answers, but to investigate what so often goes unnoticed in our experience of being alive. And this is exactly where the investigation begins to become truly interesting. Because when we look carefully at what science can explain about the brain, and what it still cannot explain, something very strange appears. We can measure neural activity, we can map brain connections, we can observe electrical signals moving through the brain, but none of this explains one fundamental thing: why conscious experience exists at all. And this leads us directly to a question that no one has been able to answer. If the brain can explain so many aspects of the mind, yet cannot explain consciousness itself, then where does consciousness actually come from? Because perhaps the greatest lie about consciousness is not just in a scientific theory. Perhaps it lies in the very way we learned to think about who we are. When we begin to examine the problem of consciousness more carefully, we notice that there's a very clear boundary between two completely different things. On one side, there is the physical world, made of matter, energy, and measurable processes. The brain belongs to that world. It is composed of cells, molecules, and electrical impulses that can be observed and recorded by scientific instruments. We can measure the speed at which neurons fire, observe how different regions of the brain communicate, and even predict certain patterns of behavior based on those processes. All of this belongs to the domain of physics and biology. But on the other side, there is something completely different. There is experience, the sensation of seeing a color, the feeling of hearing music, the silent awareness of being alive in this moment. And that experience cannot be measured in the same way we measure an electrical signal in the brain. At first, this difference may seem subtle, but when we look closely, it becomes enormous. Imagine a scientist who can perfectly observe all the brain activity of a person while they are looking at the evening sky. He could record every electrical impulse, every neural connection, every region of the brain involved in that moment. He could describe with precision everything that is happening physically inside that person's head. But even with all of that information, something remains completely invisible to scientific observation. The scientist cannot access the experience of the color of the sky. He cannot feel the emotion of that moment. He cannot perceive the sense of beauty that may be arising within that person. There's a dimension of reality that can only be known from within conscious experience itself. And this is exactly where the gap appears that has intrigued philosophers and scientists for decades. Science can explain the physical mechanisms of the brain, but it cannot cross the bridge that connects those mechanisms to conscious experience. We can perfectly describe how neurons organize themselves to process visual information, but that does not explain why the experience of seeing exists. We can map brain circuits associated with pain, but that does not explain why the feeling of suffering exists. In other words, science can explain how the brain functions, but it cannot explain why there is someone experiencing that functioning. And when we clearly recognize this gap, something begins to shift in the way we understand the relationship between mind and matter. Because perhaps consciousness is not just another physical process within the universe. Perhaps it belongs to a deeper dimension of reality. Some philosophers have suggested that trying to explain consciousness purely through matter is like trying to understand light by studying only the shadow it casts. The brain may be the structure through which consciousness manifests in the physical world, but that does not necessarily mean it is the origin of consciousness. At first, this possibility may sound radical. Yet it begins to make sense once we realize that conscious experience does not behave like an ordinary physical object. And when we follow this line of thought to its ultimate consequences, an even deeper question begins to emerge. If consciousness cannot be fully explained by the physical processes of the brain, then perhaps we have been looking at the relationship between brain and consciousness in the wrong way. Perhaps the brain is not the creator of consciousness. Perhaps it is only the instrument through which something deeper expresses itself. And this possibility leads directly to the next question in this investigation. What if the brain does not produce consciousness at all, but simply receives it? Because that hypothesis completely changes the way we understand who we truly are. When the investigation of consciousness reaches this point, something interesting begins to happen. What once seemed like a purely scientific problem slowly transforms into a much deeper question about the nature of reality itself. For centuries, most explanations of the universe have begun with a basic assumption. First, there is matter. And at some point in the evolution of the universe, consciousness emerges as a product of that matter, organized in complex ways. But when we examine the mystery of conscious experience more carefully, that assumption begins to appear far less solid than we once believed, because everything we know about the universe always appears within consciousness. Every star observed through a telescope, every scientific theory, every discovery about the nature of matter appears first as conscious experience. This simple detail has profound implications. Before any idea about the universe exists, before any theory about matter or energy appears, there must first be the experience of perceiving something. There must be the silent presence that observes thoughts, sensations, and perceptions arising moment after moment. Without that presence, no experience would be possible. There would be no colors, no sounds, no sensations, and no ideas. Even the concept of a universe would lose all meaning. And when we see this clearly, we begin to consider a possibility that many ancient spiritual traditions suggested thousands of years ago. Perhaps consciousness is not a product of physical reality. Perhaps it is the fundamental field within which all experience of reality takes place. In many contemplative traditions, this idea appears in different forms. yet it always points in the same direction. Consciousness is not something we possess in the same way we possess a body or a thought. It is the space within which all of those things appear. Thoughts arise within it, emotions arise within it, perceptions arise within it. Even the sense of being a separate individual appears within that same field of awareness. When we look closely at our direct experience, we notice that everything is constantly changing. Thoughts appear and disappear, emotions rise and dissolve, memories come and go. Yet something remains quietly present throughout all of these changes, something that witnesses everything. Perhaps that silent presence is exactly what we are trying to understand when we speak about consciousness, not as an object inside the brain, but as the field of experience within which the brain, the body, and the world appear. This possibility changes completely the way we understand who we are. Because if consciousness is truly more fundamental than we imagined, then perhaps you were never just a biological organism struggling to survive in an indifferent universe. Perhaps you are the very presence through which the universe becomes experience. And if that possibility is even partially true, then the greatest lie about consciousness was never just a scientific mistake. It was forgetting to look at what has always been closest to us, the simple experience of being conscious right now. Perhaps the greatest lie about consciousness is not only scientific, perhaps it is the idea that what you truly are is trapped inside your brain. Because if consciousness does not originate in the brain but simply expresses itself through it, then something much deeper may be happening in this very moment. Something is perceiving your thoughts. Something is perceiving your emotions. Something is perceiving the world appearing before you right now. And the question that remains is simple, yet incredibly profound. What exactly is this presence that is aware of all of this? If this investigation sparks something inside you, tell me in the comments, do you believe consciousness is produced by the brain, or that the brain is only an instrument of consciousness? I would really love to read what you think. And if you enjoy exploring questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence, consider subscribing to the channel. Because in the next video, we will investigate an even more intriguing question. If the brain has never actually touched the real world, then who is truly experiencing reality? I will see you in the next video.